Part 1. Three men stick out a strange and desperate adventure among the incredible monsters of the dark sea floor. Editor's note: this document, written on a curious kind of parchment and tied to a piece of driftwood, was reported to have been picked out of the sea near the Fiji Islands. The first and last pages were so water-soaked as to be indecipherable. Yacht Rosa was due to leave the San Francisco harbor in 2 hours. We were going on some mysterious cruise to the South Seas, the details of which I did not know. Professor George Berry, the famous zoologist, and myself are going to do some exploring that is hazardous in the extreme, Stanley had said. For purely mechanical reasons, we need a third. You are young and have no family ties, so I thought I'd ask you to go with us. I'd rather not tell you what it's all about until we are on our way. That was all the explanation he had given. It was sufficient. I was fed up with life just then. I had enough money to avoid work and was tired of playing. I must warn you that you'll risk your life in this, he had continued, in answer to my acceptance of his invitation. And I had replied that the hazard, whatever it might be, only made the trip appear more desirable. So here I was, on board the yacht, about to sail for far places on some scientific mission, which had so far been kept veiled in secrecy, and which was represented as hazardous in the extreme. It sounded attractive. Stanley came aboard, accompanied by a lean, wiry man with iron-gray hair and cool, alert black eyes. "Hello, Martin," Stanley greeted me. "I want you to meet Professor Berry, the real leader of this expedition. Professor, this young redhead is Martin Gray, a sort of nephew by adoption, who knows more about night life than most cabaret proprietors, and not much of anything else. He has shaken the dangers of the gold diggers to face with us the dangers of the tropic seas." The professor gripped my hand, and his cool black eyes gazed into mine with a kind of friendly frostiness. "Don't pay any attention to him," he advised me. 20 years ago, when I first met him, he was on his way to Africa to shoot elephants because some revue beauty had just thrown him over, and he felt he ought to do something big and heroic about it. It was shortly afterward that he decided to stay a bachelor all his life, and became such a confirmed woman-hater. He smiled thinly at Stanley's prod in the ribs, and the two went below, talking and laughing with the intimacy of old friendship. I stayed on deck, and soon found myself watching, with no little wonder, an enormous truck and trailer arrangement that drew up on the dock, heavily loaded with a single immense crate. It was for us, I speculated as to what it could possibly contain. It was a 20 or 25-foot cube solidly braced with strap iron and steel brackets. It evidently contained something fragile. The yacht's docky engine lowered a hook for it and swung it over the side, and into the hold as daintily as though it had been packed with explosives. The last of the ship's stores followed it over the side. The group of newspaper reporters who had been trying to pump the captain and first mate for a story were warned to leave, and we were ready to go. Precisely where and for what purpose? I was to find out almost immediately. Even as the yacht nosed superciliously away from the dock, the steward approached me with the information that lunch was ready. I went to the small, compactly furnished dining salon, where I was joined by Stanley and the professor. There were only the three of us at the table. Stanley Brown, noted big game hunter and semi-retired owner of the great Brown Glass Works at Altoona, a man 15 years my senior, but tanned and fit-looking. Professor Berry, well known in scientific circles, and myself, known in no branch of activity save the one Stanley had jested about, the night life of my home city, Chicago. "It's time you knew just what you're up against," said Stanley to me, after the consommé had been served. Now that we've actually sailed, there's no longer any need for secrecy. Indeed, there never has been urgent need of it. The professor and myself merely thought that we might provoke incredulity and comment if we stated the purpose of our trip publicly. He buttered a roll. We, the professor and you and I, are going in for some deep sea diving, and when I say deep, I mean deep. We are going to investigate conditions as they exist 1 mile down from the surface of the ocean. "A mile!" I exclaimed. "Why—" There I stopped. I had only a layman's knowledge of such matters, but I knew that the limit of man's submersion, till then at any rate, was a matter of a few hundred feet. "Sounds incredible, doesn't it?" said Stanley with a smile. "But that's what we're going to do, if the professor's gadget works as he seems to think it will." "I don't think it, I know it," retorted the professor. "And man, the things we have seen down there. New and unknown species. A world no human has ever seen before, perhaps the secret of all of life. Dragons, sea serpents, and what not," Stanley finished with a grin. "Or, possibly, nothing at all." The professor shrugged. "I mustn't let my scientific curiosity run away with me. Perhaps we'll find no new thing down there. Our deep-sea dredging and classification may already embrace most of the forms of life in the greater depths." "If it does, I want my money back," said Stanley. "When you asked me to finance this expedition for you, I agreed on condition that you would show me a thrill, some real big game, even if I would not be able to shoot it. If we draw blank—" "The mere descent should satisfy you, my adventuring friend," replied the professor brusquely. "I think you'll find that thrilling enough." "But 1 mile under the surface!" I marveled, feeling not entirely comfortable. "The pressure! Enormous! It can't be done. That is, I mean, can it be done?" "It had better be," said Stanley with a humor that I did not entirely appreciate. "If it isn't, the 3 of us are going to be pressed out like 3 sheets of tissue paper, for we are assuredly going down that far in the professor's gadget." "Was that the thing I saw hoisted aboard just before we left?" "That was it. We'll stroll around after lunch and look it over." If I had taken this cruise in search of distraction, I was surely going to be successful. That was plain. "Just where are we going?" I asked. "You said something about the South Seas, but you've named no special part of them." "We're bound for Penguin Deep. That's a delightful little dimple in the Kermadec Trough, which," Stanley explained, "is north-northeast of New Zealand, almost halfway up to the Fiji Islands. Penguin Deep is ticketed at 5,150 feet, but it probably runs deeper in spots." The rest of the meal was consumed in silence. I hardly tasted what I ate. I remember that. Over 5,000 feet down, where no man had ever ventured before. Could we make it? I tried to recall my neglected physics lessons and compute the pressure that far down. I couldn't, but I knew it must be an appalling total of tons to the square inch. What possible arrangement could they have brought in which to make that awful descent? And if the descent were accomplished, what in the world would we see when we got down there? Gigantic, hitherto unknown fishes? Marine growths, half animal and half vegetable? Decidedly, hot rolls and salad, cutlets and baked potatoes, good as they were, could not distract attention from the crowding questions that assailed me, and I could see that Stanley and the professor were also far away in their thoughts, probably already exploring Penguin Deep. After lunch we went forward to look at the professor's gadget, as Stanley insisted on calling it. It had been carefully unpacked by the crew while we ate, and it shimmered in the electric-lighted hold like a great bubble. It was a giant glass sphere, polished and flawless. Inside it could be made out various objects: a circular bench arrangement on a wooden flooring, batteries that filled the cup between the floor and the bottom arc of the sphere, tall metal cylinders, a small searchlight set next to a mechanism that was indeterminate. At 3 equidistant points on the sides there were glass handles, as thick as a man's thigh, cast integral with the walls. On the top there was a smaller handle. At first glance the sphere seemed all in one piece, with the central objects cast inside like a toy ship in a sealed bottle. Then a mathematically precise ring of prismatic reflections showed me that the top third of the ball was a separate piece, fitting conically down like the tapered glass stopper of a monstrous perfume bottle. The handle on the top was for the purpose of lifting this giant's teapot lid and allowing entrance into the sphere. "Isn't it a beauty?" murmured Stanley. "It ought to be," he added. "It cost me $86,000 to make it in my own glass factory. 11 castings before this one came along that was reasonably free of flaws. 22 feet 6 inches over all, walls 5 feet thick, new formula unbreakable glass, 4 men working a month to grind the lid into place, tolerance limits plus or minus 0. He slapped the professor's shoulders. "Let's go in and look over the apparatus." To accommodate the huge ball, a well had been constructed in the Rosa's hold. This brought the deck we were standing on up to within 6 feet of the top ring, above which was rigged a chain hoist for lifting the ponderous lid. The hoist was revolved, the conical top was swung free, and we clambered into our unique diving shell. The tall cylinders were revealed as great flasks of compressed air. The indeterminate thing beside the searchlight turned out to be a hand pump, geared to work against heavy pressure. From the suction chamber of this 3 tubes extended. "We inhale the air of the chamber," the professor explained to me, "and exhale through the tubes into the pump cylinder. Breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth. The pump piston is forced down by this geared handle, sending the used air out of the shell through this 1/16-inch hole. A ball-check valve keeps the water from squirting in when the exhaust pressure is released." He pointed to a telegraphic key which completed a circuit from the batteries in the bottom of the ball to a thread of copper cast through the lid. "That's your plaything, Martin. You are to raise or lower us by pressing that key. It controls the donkey engine electrically, so that we guide our own destinies, though we are a mile beneath our power plant. Stanley works the pump. I direct the searchlight, write down notes, and, I sincerely hope, take snapshots of deep-sea life." For a moment my part of the labor seemed so easy as to be unfair. Merely to sit there and punch a little key at raising and lowering time! But as I thought it over, it began to appear more difficult. The Rosa could not anchor, of course, in a mile of water. We would drift helplessly. If we approached an undersea cliff, I must raise us at once to prevent us being smashed against it. And if the cliff were too lofty to be cleared in time— I mentioned this to the professor. "That would be unfortunate," he said, with his frosty smile. "Stanley assures us this glass is unbreakable. He means commercially unbreakable. What would happen to it if it were submitted to the strain of being flung against a rock pile, in addition to the enormous stress of the water pressure? I don't know. It's your job to see that we don't have to find out." It had been planned to test the sphere empty first to see how it stood the strain. We drifted to a full stop over the center of Penguin Deep, where we were to gamble our lives in a game with Neptune. Sea anchors were rigged to lessen our drift, and the donkey engine was geared to the first cable drum. There was an impressive row of these drums, each holding an interminable length of 3/4 inch cable. The bulk of a mile of steel cable has to be seen to be believed. The glass sphere was lifted from the hold delicately for all its enormous weight, and swung over the rail preparatory to being lowered into the depths. Not until that moment did I notice two things: that there was no fastening of any kind to keep the thick lid in place, and that the 3/4 inch cable looked like a pack thread in comparison to the ponderous bulk it strained to support. "We couldn't use a heavier cable," said the professor, "because of the strain. We're overloading the hoist as it is. As for the lid being fastened down, I think you'll find it will be pressed into place securely enough." There was unanimous silence as the great globe slipped into the sea, down and down until the last reflection of the morning sun ceased to shimmer from its surface. Drum after drum was played out, till the first mate held his hand up to check the engineer. 5,000 feet, sir," he called to Stanley. "Haul it back up, and let us hope," Stanley added fervently, "that we'll find the gadget in one piece." The engine began to snort rhythmically. Dripping, vibrating, the coils of cable began to crawl back in place on the drums. There was a glint under the surface again as the sunlight reflected on the nearing sphere. The great ball flashed out of the water, and a cheer burst from the throats of all of us. It was absolutely unharmed. Only there was a beading of fine moisture inside the thick globe. What that could mean, none of us could figure out. "Difference in temperature?" worried the professor. "No, it's as cold inside as out. Molecules of water, driven by sheer pressure through 5 feet of glass, to unite in drops on the inside? Possibly. Well, there's one way to find out. Stanley, Martin, are you ready?" We nodded, and prepared to visit the bottom a mile below the Rosa's keel. The preparation consisted merely in donning heavy fleece-lined jumpers to protect us from the cold of the sunless depths. Soberly we entered the ball to undergo whatever ordeal awaited us on the distant ocean floor. How comparative distance is! A mile walk in the country, it is nothing. A mile ascent in an airplane, a trifle. But a mile descent into pitch-black, bone-chilling depths of water, that is an immense distance. Copper wire on a separate drum was connected from the engine switch to the copper thread that curled through the glass wall to my telegraphic key. We strapped the mouthpieces of the breathing tubes over our heads, and Brown started the slow turning of the compression pump. The professor snapped the searchlight on and off several times to see that it was in working shape. He raised his hand, I pressed the key, and the long descent began. That plunge into the bottomless depths remains in my memory almost as clearly as the far more fantastic adventures that came to us later. Smoothly, rapidly, the yellow-green of the surface water dimmed to olive. This in turn grew blacker and blacker. Then we were slipping down into pitch darkness. A big bubble lit by a meager lamp and containing 3 fragile human beings that dared to trust the soft pulp of their bodies to the crushing weight of the deepest ocean. The most impressive thing was the utter soundlessness of our descent. At first there had been a pulsing throb of the donkey engine transmitted to us by the sustaining cable. This died as we slid farther from the Rosa. At length it was hushed entirely, cushioned by the springy length of steel. There was no stir, no sound of any kind. As far as our senses could tell, we were hanging motionless in the pressing, awesome blackness. The professor switched off our light and turned on the searchlight, which he trained downward through the wall at as steep an angle as the flooring would permit. Even then the illusion of motionlessness was preserved. There was nothing in the water to mark our progress. We might have been floating in a black void of space. Down and down we went, for an interminable length of time, till at length we reached the abysmal level where the sun never shone, and the eyes of men had never gazed till now. Words were made to describe familiar articles. I find now, when I am faced with the necessity of portraying events and objects beyond the range of normal human experience, that I cannot conjure up words to fit. I despair of trying to make you see what we saw, and felt what we felt. But try to picture yourself in the glass ball with us. All is profound blackness, save for a streak of white, dying about 50 feet away, which is the beam of our searchlight. 20 feet below is a bare floor of flinty lava and broken shell. This is unrelieved by seaweed of any kind, appearing like an imagined fragment of Martian or lunar landscape. The ball sways idly to the push of some explicable submarine current. It is like being in a captive balloon, except that the connecting cable extends stiffly upward instead of downward. There is a realization, an instinctive feel of awful pressure around you. Logic tells you how you are clamped about, but deeper than logic is the intuition that the glass walls are pressing in on themselves at the point of collapse. Your ears tingle with the feel of it, your head rings with it. You are breathing in through your nose, thin, unsatisfying gulps of air that cause your lungs to labor at their task, and you are exhaling through your mouth with difficulty into the barrel of the powerful pump. No bubbles arise from the tiny hole where the used air is forced into the water. The pressure is too enormous for that. Only a thin milky line marks its escape from the sphere. In a ghostly way you see Stanley turning the pump handle. With a handful of waste which he has borrowed from the Rose's engine room, the professor wipes from the section of wall through which the searchlight plays the moisture that constantly collects there. I sit with my hand near the key, peering downward and ahead like an engineer in a locomotive cab, ready to raise the shell or lower it as occasion warrants. And always the suffocating awareness of pressure. Strange and mystic journey as the tortured glass sphere floated over the bottom, following the slow drift of the Rosa far above. The finger of light played along the tilted side of a wrecked tramp steamer. There was a crumpled gash in the bow. From this ragged hole suddenly appeared a great serpentine form. The professor clutched at his camera, pointed it, and clenched his hands in a frenzy of disappointment. The serpent shape had disappeared back into the hull. A little later, and we had drifted slowly past the wreck. "Damn it!" the professor snatched away his mouthpiece to exclaim. "If we could only stop!" The bottom changed character shortly after we had passed the hulk. We began to creep over low, gently rounded mounds. These were so regular in form that they were puzzling. About 50 feet across and 10 in altitude, they looked artificial in their symmetry, like great saucers set on the ocean floor, bottom side up. They took on a dirty black hue as our light struck them, and glowed with a faint phosphorescence as they stretched away into the darkness. A 12-foot monstrosity, all toad-like head and eyes, swam into the light beam and bumped blindly against the glass ball. For an instant it goggled crazily at us. The professor took its picture. It blundered away. As it reached the darkness beyond the beam, it, too, showed phosphorescent. A belt of blue-white spots, like the portholes of a liner, extended down its ugly sides. Along the bottom, between the curious mounds, writhed a worm-like thing, but it was too huge to be described as truly worm-like. It was 18 or 20 feet long and about a foot thick. It was blood-red, almost blunt-ended, and patently without eyes. I took my gaze off it for an instant. When I looked again, it had disappeared. I blinked at this seeming miracle, and then discovered a foot or two of its tail protruding from under the edge of one of the mounds. It was threshing furiously about. It was at this instant that I suddenly found increased difficulty and glanced at Stanley. He had stopped pumping and was clutching at the professor's arm with one hand while he pointed down with the other. The professor motioned him toward the pump and began to click pictures furiously with the camera pointed at the nearest mound. Wondering at the urgency of Stanley's gesture and the frantic clicking of the camera shutter, I looked more closely at the curious saucer-like hump. Under closer inspection, something remarkably like a huge mud-colored eye was revealed, and as we drifted along, 20 feet away on the farther slope, another appeared. Paralyzed, I stared at the edges of the thing. They were waving almost imperceptibly up and down, creeping. The mounds were living creatures. Acres and acres of them lying lethargically on the bottom, waiting for something to crawl within range of their monstrous edges. Involuntarily, I pressed the key to raise us, but we had gone only a few feet when the professor called to me. "Down again, Martin. I don't think these things will bother us unless we scrape against them. Anyway, they can't hurt the shell." I lowered the ball to our former 20-foot level, and there we swung just over the monsters' backs. The professor had said that the giant inverted saucers would probably not bother us if we did not come in contact with them. It soon became apparent that, in a measure, he was right. The creatures either could not or would not lift their enormous bulks from the sea floor. A gigantic wriggling thing, all grotesque fringe and tentacles, drifted down into the range of our light. Lower it floated until it hovered just above one of the larger mounds. The professor got its portrait. At the same instant, as though it had heard the click of the shutter and been frightened by it, the thing dropped another foot and touched the sloping back. With the speed of light, the inverted saucer became a cup. Like a clenching fist, the cup closed over one of the straggling tentacles. There followed a tug of war that was all the more ghastly for its soundlessness. The hunted jerked spasmodically to get away from the hunter. So wild were its efforts that several times it raised the monster clear of the bottom for a foot or so, but the grim clutch could not be broken. Closer and closer it was dragged. Then, after a supreme paroxysm, the tentacle parted and the prey escaped. The tentacle disappeared into the mass of the baffled hunter. It made no attempt to follow the fleeing creature. It slowly relaxed along the bottom and waited for its next meal. The unearthly incident gave us fresh confidence, convincing us that the monsters did not move unless they were directly touched. Of course, we could not foresee the fatal accident that was going to put us within reach of one of the giant saucers.
Part 2. We thought for a while that these great blobs of cold life were the largest creatures of the depths. It was soon made clear to us how mistaken that notion was. For a time we gazed spellbound at the nightmare assortment of grotesqueries that gradually assembled around us, attracted no doubt by our light. The things were mainly sightless and of indescribable shape. Most of them were phosphorescent, and they avoided collisions in a way that suggested that they had some buried sense of light perception. As time passed, the professor emptied his camera, refilled it several times, and groaned that he had no more film. Twice as we drifted along, I raised us to keep us clear of a gradual upward slope of the smooth floor. Stanley removed his mouthpiece long enough to suggest that we go back to the surface. We had been submerged for nearly 4 hours now. But before we could reply, a violent movement was felt. The ball rocked and twirled so that we were forced to cling to the circular bench to avoid being thrown to the floor. It was as though a hurricane of wind had suddenly penetrated the unruffled depths. "Earthquake?" called Stanley. "Don't know," answered the professor. He swung the searchlight in an arc and focused it at length on something that appeared only as a field of blurred movement. He wiped the moisture from the wall before the lens, and there was revealed to us a sight that makes my heart pound even now when I recall it to memory. Something vast and serpentine had ventured too near the bottom, and had been caught by the death traps there. The creature was a writhing mass of gigantic coils. It was impossible even to guess at its length, but its girth was such that the mound-shaped monsters that had fastened to it could not entirely encircle it. There it twined and knotted, a mighty serpent of the deepest ocean, snapping its awful length and threshing its powerful tail in an effort to dislodge the giant leeches that were flattened against it. And every time it touched the bottom in its blind frenzy, more of the teeming death traps attached themselves to it, crawling over their fellows in an effort to find unoccupied areas. Soon the sea serpent was a distorted, creeping mass. For one appalling instant its head came into our view. It resembled the head of a crocodile, only it was 10 times larger and covered with scale like the armor plate of a destroyer. The jaws, wide open and slashing with enormous needle-shaped teeth at the huge parasites, were large enough to have held our glass sphere. One eye appeared. It was at least 3 feet across and of a shimmering amethyst color. One of the deadly saucers wrapped itself around the great head. The entire mass of attackers and attacked settled slowly to the bottom. But before it completely succumbed, the beaten monster gave one last convulsive flick of its tail. "Good God!" cried Stanley, shrinking away from the pump and staring upward. I followed his gaze with my own eyes. In the faint reflected glow of the searchlight, I could see row on row of large cups flattened against the top of the ball. As I watched, these flattened still more, and the big sphere quivered perceptibly. In its death struggle, the mighty serpent had flicked one of the huge leeches against us. It now clung there with blind tenacity, covering nearly 2/3 of our shell with the underside of its body. I reached for the control key to send us to the surface. "Don't!" snapped the professor. "The weight!" He needed to say no more. My hand recoiled as though the key had been red hot. The 3/4-inch cable above us was now sustaining, in addition to its own huge weight, our massive glass ball and the appalling tonnage of this grim blanket of flesh that encircled us. Could it further hold against the strain of lifting that combined tonnage through the press of the water? Almost certainly it could not. There was nothing we could do but hang there and discover at first hand exactly what happened to things that were clamped in those mighty living vices. The professor turned on the interior bulb. The result was ghastly. It showed every detail of the belly of the thing that gripped us. Crowded over its entire undersurface were gristly flattened suckers. Now and then a convulsive ripple ran through its surface tissue and great ridges of flesh stood out. With each squeeze the glass shell quivered ominously, as though the extreme limit of its pressure-resisting power were being reached, and passed. "A nice fix," remarked the professor, his calm, dry voice acting like a tonic in that moment of fear. "If we try to go up, the cable would probably break. If we try to outlast the patience of this thing, we might run out of air, or actually be staved in." He paused thoughtfully. "I suggest, though, that we follow the latter course for a while at least. It would be just too bad if that cable broke, gentlemen." Stanley shuddered, and looked at the dirty white belly that pressed against the glass walls on all sides. "I vote we stay here for a time." "And I," was my addition. I relieved Stanley at the pump. He and the professor sat down on the bench. Casting frequent glances at the constricted blanket of flesh that covered us, we prepared to wait as composedly as we might for the thing to give up its effort to smash our shell. The hour that followed was longer than any full day I have ever lived through. Had I not confirmed the passage of time by looking at my watch, I would have sworn that at least 20 hours had passed. Every half minute I gazed at that weaving pattern of cup-shaped suckers only 5 feet away, trying to see if they were relaxing in their pressure. I attempted to persuade myself that they were, but I knew I was only imagining it. Actually, they were pressed as flat as ever, and the sphere still quivered at regular intervals as the heavy body squeezed in on itself. There was no sign that this blind, mindless patience was becoming exhausted. There was little conversation during that interminable hour. Stanley grinned wryly once and commented on the creature's disappointment if it actually succeeded in getting at us. We'd be scattered all over the surrounding half-mile by the pressure of the water, he said. There'd be nothing left of our pet to feed on but 5-foot chunks of broken glass. Not a very satisfying meal. We might try to reason with the thing, point out how foolish it is to waste its time on us, I suggested, trying to appear as nonchalant as he was. The Professor said nothing. He was coolly writing in his notebook, describing minutely the appearance of our abysmal captor. Finally I chanced to look down through a section of wall not covered by our stubborn enemy. I wiped the moisture from the glass before the searchlight so that I could see more clearly. The bottom seemed to be heaving up and down. I blinked my eyes and looked again. It was not an illusion. With a regular dip and rise, we were approaching to within a few feet of the rocky floor and moving back up again. Also, we were floating faster than at any time previous. The bottom was bare again. We had left the crowding, ominous mounds. I waved to the Professor. He snapped his notebook shut and stared at the uneasy ocean bottom. "I've been hoping I was wrong," he said simply. "I thought I felt a wavy motion 15 minutes ago, and it seemed to me to increase steadily." The three of us stared at each other. "You mean," began Stanley with a shudder, "I mean that the Rosa, 1 mile above us, is having difficulties. A storm. Judging from our movement, it must be a hurricane. The length of cable would cushion us from any average wave, and we are rising and falling at least 15 feet. "My God," groaned Stanley, "the Rosa is already heeled with the weight of us. She could never weather a hurricane." The plight of the crew above our heads was as clear to us as though we had been aboard with them. Should they cut the cable, figuring that the lives of the three of us were certainly not to be set against the 30 on the yacht? Should they disconnect the electric control and try to haul us up regardless? Or should they try to ride out the storm in spite of being crippled by the drag of us? "I think if I were up there, I'd cut us adrift," said Stanley grimly. Both the Professor and myself nodded. "Though," he added hopefully, "my captain is a good gambler." The cable quivered like a live thing under the terrific strain. At each downward swoop, before the upswing began, there was a sickening sag. "We no longer have a decision to make," said the Professor. "Press the key, Martin, and God grant us we can rise with all this dead weight." And at that instant the crew of the Rosa were also relieved of the necessity for making a decision. At the bottom of one of those long, sickening falls there was a jerk, and we continued on down to the ocean floor. The sphere rolled over, jumbling the equipment in a tangled mess with the three of us in the center, bruised and cut. The light snapped off as the battery connections were torn loose. There we lay at the bottom of Penguin Deep, in an inert sphere that was dead and dark in the surrounding blackness, a coffin of glass to hold us through the centuries. "Martin," I heard the Professor's voice after a time. "Stanley, can either of you move? I'm caught." "I'm caught too," came Stanley's gasping answer. "Something on my leg. Feels like it's broken." A heavy object was pressing against my body. With an effort I freed myself and fumbled in the pitch darkness for the other two. "Lights first," commanded the Professor. "The pump, you know." "I do know." Frantically I scrambled in the dark till I located the batteries. They were right side up and still wired together. The air grew rapidly foul, with no one at the pump. Panting for breath, I blundered at the task of connecting the light. After what seemed an eternity, I accomplished it. The light revealed Stanley with an air tank laying across his leg. The mouthpiece of his breathing tube had been forced back over his head, gashing his face in its journey. His face was white with pain. The Professor was caught under the heavy bench. I freed him, and together we attended to Stanley, finding that his leg wasn't broken, but only badly bruised. The mound-shaped monster, dislodged possibly by the fall, was nowhere to be seen. I resumed work at the pump, the connections of which were so strongly contrived that they had withstood the shock of the upset. For a moment we were content to rest while the air grew purer. Then we were forced squarely to face our fate. The Professor summed up the facts in a few concise words. "We're certainly doomed. Here at the bottom of Penguin Deep, we're as out of reach of help as though we were stranded on the moon. We're as good as dead right now." "If we have nothing left to hope for," whispered Stanley after a time, "we might as well close the air valves and get it over with at once. No use torturing ourselves." The Professor moistened his lips. "It might be wise." He turned to me. "What's your opinion, Martin?" But I confess I had not the stark courage of these two. "No, no," I cried out. Let's keep on living as long as the air holds out. Something might happen." I avoided their eyes as I said it, utterly ashamed of my cowardly quibbling with death. What in the name of God could possibly happen to help us? The Professor shrugged dully, and nodded. "I feel with Stanley that we ought to get it over in one short stab. But we have no right to force you." His voice trailed off. We readjusted our mouthpieces. I turned automatically at the pump, and we silently awaited the last suffocating moment of our final doom. As before, attracted by the light, a strange assortment of deep sea life wriggled and darted about us, swimming lazily among the looped coils and twists of our cable which had settled down around us. Among these were certain fish that resembled great porcupines. Spines a foot and a half long, like living knife blades, protected them from the attacks of other species. They were the only things we saw that were not constantly writhing away from the jaws of some hostile monster, the only things that seemed able to swim about their own affairs without even deigning to watch for danger. Fascinated, I watched the 6-foot creatures. Here were we, reasoning humans, supposed lords of creation, slowly but surely perishing, while only a few feet away one of the lowest forms of life could exist in perfect safety and tranquility. Then, as I watched them, I seemed to see a difference in some of them. A majority of them had 2 fins just behind the gill slits, typical fish tails and blunt, sloping heads. But now and then I saw a spined monster that was queerly unlike its fellows. Instead of 2 front fins, these unique ones had 2 vacant round holes. The head looked as though it had forgotten to grow. Its place was taken by an eyeless, projecting, shield-shaped cap. And there was no tail. Glad to find something to distract my half-crazed thoughts, I studied the nearest of these. They moved slower than their tailed and finned brothers, I noticed. I wondered how they could move at all, lacking in any kind of motive power as they seemed to be. Next instant, the secret of their movement was made clear. Out of the empty fin holes of the creature I was studying crept 2 long, powerful-looking tentacles. But these were not true tentacles. There were no vacuum discs on them, and they moved as though supported by jointed bones, like arms. The arms ended in flat paddles that resembled hands. These threshed the water in a sort of breaststroke, propelling the body forward. Shortly after the arms had appeared, the spiny headcap was cautiously extended a few inches forward from the main shell. Further, it was extended as the head of a turtle might slowly appear from the projection of its bony case, and under it— "Professor!" I screamed wildly. "My God! Look!" Both the Professor and Stanley merely stared dully at me. I babbled of what I had seen. A man! A human-looking thing, anyway. Arms and a head. A man inside a fish's spined hide. Like armor. They looked pityingly at me. The Professor laid his hand on my shoulder. "Now, now," he soothed. "Don't go to pieces." "I tell you I saw it!" I shouted. Then, shrinking from the hysterical loudness of my own voice, I lowered my tone. "Something that looks human has occupied some of those prickly 6-foot shells. I saw arms and a man's head. I swear it." "Nonsense. How could a human being stand the cold, the pressure?" Here I happened to glance at the wall of the shell through which the searchlight shone. "Look! See for yourself!" Squarely in the rays of the light showed a head, projecting from one of the shells and capped with a wide flat helmet of horned bone. There were eyes and nose and mouth placed on one side of that head. A face. There were even tabs of flesh or bony protuberances that resembled ears. "Curious," muttered the Professor, staring. "It certainly looks human enough to talk. But it's only a fish, nevertheless. See, in the throat are gill slits. But the eyes, look at them. They're not the eyes of a fish." And they were not. There was in them a light of reason, of intelligence. Those eyes were roaming brightly over us, observing the light, the equipment, seeming to note our amazement as we crowded to look at it. The sphere rocked slightly. Behind the staring, man-like visitor there was a glimpse of enormous crocodile jaws and huge amethyst eyes. Instantly the head and arms receded, leaving an empty-seeming, lifeless shell. An impregnable fortress of spines, the thing drifted slowly away through the twisted loops of cable. "It certainly looked like—" began Stanley shakily. "The creature was just a fish," said the Professor, shaking his head at the light in Stanley's eyes. Some sort of giant parasite that inhabits the shells of other fish. He opened the valve of the last air cylinder and seated himself resignedly on the bench. We have another half hour or so. All of us suddenly put our hands out to brace ourselves. The sphere had moved. "Look at the cable," called Stanley. We did so. It was moving, writhing away from us over the bottom as though abruptly given life of its own. Coil after coil disappeared into the further gloom. At length the cable was straight. The ball moved again, was dragged a few feet along the rocky floor. Something, possessed of incredible vast power, had seized the end of the steel cable and was reeling us in as a fisherman reels in a trout. Slowly, unsteadily, we slid along the ocean floor. Ahead of us appeared a jagged black wall, a cliff. There was a gloomy hole at its base. Toward this we were being dragged by whatever it was that had caught the end of the cable. Helpless, we watched ourselves engulfed by the murky den. In the beam of the searchlight we saw that the submarine cavern extended on and on for an unguessable depth. The cable, taut with the strain, stretched ahead out of sight. Time had been lost track of during that mysterious, ominous journey. It was recalled to us by the state of the air we were breathing. The Professor removed his mouthpiece and cast the tube aside. "You might as well stop pumping, Martin," he said quietly. "We're done. There's no more air in the flask." We stared at each other. Then we shook hands, solemnly, tremulously, taking leave of each other before we departed on that longest of all journeys. The air in that small space was rapidly exhausted. We lay on the floor, laboring for breath, and closed our eyes. The Professor, the oldest of the three of us, succumbed first. I heard his breath whistle stertorously, and glancing at him, saw that he was in a coma. In a moment Stanley had joined him in blessed unconsciousness. I could feel myself drifting off. Hammers beat at my ears. Daggers pierced my heaving lungs. Hazily I could see scores of the bristly, man-like fish when I opened my eyes and glanced through the walls. It was not one monster then, but many that had brought us to their lair. Abruptly, as though a signal had been given, they all streamed back toward the mouth of the cavern. My eyesight dimmed, the hammers pulsed louder, a veil descended over my senses, and I knew no more. A soft, sustained roar came to my ears. Through my closed eyelids I could sense light. A dank, fishy smell came to my nostrils. I groaned and moved feebly, finding that I was resting on something soft and pleasant. Dazedly I opened my eyes and sat up. An exclamation burst from me as I suddenly remembered what had gone before, and realized that somehow, incredibly, I was still living. Feeling like a man who has waked from a nightmarish sleep to find himself in his tomb, I gazed about. I was in a long, lofty rock chamber, the uneven floor of which was covered with shallow pools of water. The further end was of smooth-grained stone that resembled cement. The near end was rough like the walls, but in it there was a small symmetrical arch, the mouth of a passage leading away to some other point in the bowels of the earth. The place was flooded with clear light that had a rosy tinge. From my position on the floor I could not see what made the light. It streamed from a crevice that extended clear around the cave, parallel with the floor and about 12 feet above it. From this groove, along with the light, came the soft roaring hiss. Beside me was the glass ball, the cover off and laying a few feet away from the opening in the top. There was no trace of Stanley or the Professor. I rose from my couch, a thick mattress-like affair of soft, pliant hide, and walked feebly toward the small arch in the near end of the cave. Even as I approached it I heard footsteps, and voices resounded in some slurring musical language. Half a dozen figures suddenly came into view. They were men, as human as myself. Indeed, as I gazed at them, I felt inclined to think they were even more human. They were magnificent specimens. The smallest could not have been less than 6 feet 3, and all of them were muscular and finely proportioned. Their faces were arresting in their expression of calm strength and kindliness. They looked like gods, arrayed in soft, thick, beautifully tanned hides in this rosy-tinted hole a mile below the ocean's top. They stared at me for an instant, then advanced toward me. My face must have reflected alarm, for the tallest of them held up his hand, palm outward, in a peaceful gesture. The leader spoke to me. Of course the slurred, melodious syllable meant nothing to me. He smiled and indicated that I was to follow him. I did so, hardly aware of what I was doing, my brain reeling in an attempt to grasp the situation. How marvelous, how utterly incredible to find human beings here! How many were there? Where had they come from? How had they salvaged us from Penguin Deep? I gave it up, striding along with my towering guards like a man walking in his sleep. At length the low passageway ended, and I exclaimed aloud at what I saw. I was looking down a long avenue of buildings, all 3 stories in height. There were large door and window apertures, but no doors nor window panes. In front of each house was a small square, with wonder of wonders, a lawn of whitish-yellow vegetation that resembled grass. In some of the lawns were set artistic fountains of carved rock. I might have been looking down any prosperous earthly subdivision, save for the fact that the roofs of the houses were the earth itself, which the building walls, in addition to functioning as partitions, served to support. Also, earthly subdivisions aren't usually illuminated with rosy light that comes softly roaring from jets set in the walls. We were walking toward a more brightly lighted area that showed ahead of us. On the way we passed intersections where other, similar streets branched geometrically away to right and left. These were smaller than the one we were on, indicating that ours was Main Street in this bizarre submarine city. Faces appeared at door and window openings to peer at me as we passed, and even in that jumbled moment I had time to realize that these folk could restrain curiosity better than we can atop the earth. There was no hubbub, no running out to tag after the queerly dressed foreigner and shout humorous remarks at him. We approached the bright spot I had noticed from afar. It was an open square, about a city block in area, in the center of which was a royal-looking building covered with blazing fragments of crystal, and so brilliantly resplendent with light that it seemed to glow at the heart of a pink fire. I was led toward this and in through a wide doorway. As courteously as though I were a visiting king, I was conducted up a great staircase, down a corridor set with more of the sparkling crystals, and into a huge low room. There my escort bowed and left me.
Part 3. Still feeling that I could not possibly be awake and seeing actual things, I glanced around. In a corner was another of the mattress-like couches made of the thick, soft hide that seemed to be the principal fabric of the place. A few feet away was a table set with dishes of food in barbaric profusion. None of the viands looked familiar, but all appealed to the appetite. The floor was strewn with soft skins, and comfortable, carved benches were scattered about. I walked to the window and looked out. Underneath was a plot of the cream-colored grass through which ran a tiny stream. This widened at intervals into clear pools beside which were set stone benches. 100 yards away was the edge of the square, where the regular 3-storied houses began. While I was staring at this unearthly vista, still unable to think with any coherence, I heard my name called. I turned to face Stanley and the professor. Both were pale in the rose light, and Stanley limped with the pain of his bruised leg. Both had recovered from their partial suffocation as completely as had I. "We thought perhaps you decided to swim back up the Rosa and leave us to our fates," said Stanley, after we had stopped plumbing each other's arms and had seated ourselves. "And I thought, well, I didn't think much of anything," I replied. "I was too busy straining my eyesight over the wonders of this city. Did you ever see anything like it?" "We haven't seen it at all, save for a view from the windows," said Stanley. "All we know of the place is that a while ago we woke up in a room like this, only much smaller and less lavish. I wonder why you rate this distinction." I described the streets as I had seen them. It is impossible for me to think of them as anything but streets. It would seem as though the rock roof over all would give the appearance of a series of tunnels, but I had always the impression of airiness and openness. "Light and heat are furnished by natural gas," said the professor, when I remarked on the perfection of these two necessities. "That's what makes the low roaring noise, the thousands of burning jets. But the presence of gas here isn't as unusual as the presence of air. Where does that come from? Through wandering underground mazes from some cave mouth in the Fiji Islands to the north? That would indicate that all the earth around here is honeycombed like a gigantic section of sponge. I wonder... Have you ever any idea how we were rescued? I interrupted, a little impatient of his abstract scientific ponderings. We have, said Stanley. A woman told us. We woke up to find her nursing us. Gorgeous-looking thing. Finest woman I've ever seen, and I've seen a good many. She didn't exactly tell us, remarked the professor, with his thin smile. Women were only interesting to him as biological studies. She drew a diagram that explained it. That tunnel, Martin, was like the outer living chamber of a submarine. We were hauled in on big glass windlasses, driven by gas turbines, I think. Once we were inside, a 20-yard counterbalanced wall of rock was lowered across the entrance. Then the water was drained out through a well and into a subterranean body of water that extends under the entire city. And here we are. We fell silent. Here we were. But what was going to happen to us among these friendly-seeming people, and how, if ever, were we going to get back to the earth's surface, were questions we could not even try to answer. We ate of the appetizing food laid out on the long table. Shortly afterward, we heard steps in the corridor outside the room. A woman entered. She was ravishingly beautiful, tall, slender, but symmetrically rounded. A soft leather robe slanted upward across her breast to a single shoulder fastening and ended just above her knees in a skirt arrangement. Around her head was a regal circlet of silvery gray metal, with a flashing bit of crystal set in the center above her broad, low forehead. She smiled at Stanley, who looked dazzled and smiled eagerly back. She pointed toward the door, signifying that we were to go with her. We did so, and we were led down a great staircase into a huge room that took up half the ground floor of the building. And here we met the nobility of the little kingdom, the upper class that governed the immaculate little city. They were standing along the walls, leaving a lane down the center of the room, tall, finely modeled men and women dressed in the single garments of soft leather. There were people there with gray hair and wisdom-wrinkled faces, but all were alike in being erect of body, firm of bearing, and in splendid health. They stopped talking as we entered the big room. Our gaze strayed ahead down the lane toward the further wall. Here was a raised dais. On it was a gleaming crystal-encrusted throne, and occupying it was the most queenly, exquisitely beautiful woman I had ever dreamed about. Woman, she was just a girl in years in spite of her grave and royal air. Her eyes were deep velvet. Her hair was black as ebony and gleaming with sudden glints of light. Her skin, but she cannot be described. Only a great painter could give a hint of her glory. Too, I might truthfully be described as a prejudiced about her perfections. The queen, for patiently she was that, bowed graciously at us. It seemed to me, though I told myself that I was an imaginative fool, that her eyes rested longest on me, and had in them an expression not granted to the professor or Stanley. She spoke to us in a melodious sentence or two, and waved her beautiful hand in which was a short ivory wand, evidently a scepter. "She's probably giving us the keys to the city," whispered Stanley. He edged nearer the fair one who had conducted us. "I sincerely hope there's room here for us." The open lane closed in on us. Men and women crowded about us, speaking to us, and smiling ruefully as they realized we could not understand. I noticed that, for some curious reason, they seemed fascinated by the color of my hair. Red-haired men were evidently scarce there. At length the beauty who had captured Stanley's fancy, and who seemed to have been appointed a sort of mentor for us, suggested in sign language that we might want to return to our quarters. It was a welcome suggestion. We were done in by the experiences and emotions that had gripped us since leaving the Rosa, such an incredibly few hours ago. We went back to the second floor. I to my luxurious big apartment, and Stanley and the professor to their smaller but equally comfortable rooms. A pleasant period slid by, every waking hour of which was filled with new experiences. The city's name, we found, was Zyobor. It was a perfect little community. There were artisans and thinkers, artists and laborers, all alike in being physically perfect beyond belief, and cultured as no race on top the ground is cultured. As we began to learn the language, more exact details of the practical methods of existence were revealed to us. The surrounding earth furnished them with building materials, metals, and unlimited gas. The sea, so near to us and yet so securely walled away, gave them food, which warrants a more detailed description. We were informed that the man-like two-armed fishes were the servants of these people, domesticated animals, in a sense, only of an extremely high order of intelligence. They were directed by mental telepathy. Every man, woman, and child in Zyobor was skilled at thought projection. They conversed constantly, from end to end of the city, by mental telepathy. Protected in their splendid shells, which they captured from the schools of porcupine fish that swarmed in Penguin Deep, they gathered sea vegetation from the higher levels and trapped sea creatures. These were brought into the subterranean chamber where our glass ball now reposed. Then the chamber was emptied of water, and the food was borne to the city. The vast army of moundfish provided the bulk of the population's food, and also furnished the thick, pliant skin they used for clothing and drapes. They were cultivated as we cultivate cattle, an ominous herd, to be handled with care and approached by the fish servants with due caution. Thus, with all reasonable wants satisfied, with talent and brains to design beautiful surroundings, lighted and warmed by inexhaustible natural gas, these fortunate beings lived their sheltered lives in the rosy underground world. At least, I thought their lives were sheltered then. It was only later, when talking to the beautiful young queen, that I learned of the dread menace that had begun to draw near to them just a short time before we were rescued. My first impression, when we had entered the throne room that first day, that the Queen had regarded me more intently than she had Stanley or the Professor, had been right. It pleased her to treat me as an equal, and to give me more of her time than was granted to any other person in the city. Every day, for a growing number of hours, we were together in her apartment. She personally instructed me in the language, and such was my desire to talk to this radiant being that I made an apt pupil. Soon I had progressed enough to converse with her, in a stilted, incorrect way, on all but the most abstract of subjects. It was a fine language. I liked it, as I liked everything else about Zyobor. The upper earth seemed far away and well forgotten. Her name, I found, was Aga, a beautiful name. "How did your kingdom begin?" I asked her one day while we were sitting beside one of the small pools in the gardens. We were close together. Now and then my shoulder touched hers, and she did not draw away. "I know not," she replied. "It is older than any of our ancient records can say. I am the 311th of the present reigning line." "And we are the first to enter thy realm from the upper world?" "Thou art the first. There is no other entrance but the seaway into which we were drawn?" "There is no other entrance." I was silent, trying to realize the finality of my residence here. At the moment I didn't care much if I never got home. "In the monarchies we know above," I said finally, avoiding her violet eyes, "it is not the custom for the queen or king to reign alone. A consort is chosen. Is it not so here? Hast thou not, among thy nobles, some one thou hast destined?" I stopped, feeling that if she dismissed me in anger and never spoke to me again, the punishment would be just. But she wasn't angry. A lovely tide of color stained her cheeks. Her lips parted, and she turned her head. For a long time she said nothing. Then she faced me, with a light in her eyes that sent the blood racing in my veins. "I have not yet chosen," she murmured. "Mayhap soon I shall tell thee why." She rose and hurried back toward the palace, but at the door she paused and smiled at me in a way that had nothing whatever to do with queenship. As the time sped by, the three of us settled into the routine of the city as though we had never known of anything else. The professor spent most of his time down by the sea chamber where the food was dragged in by the intelligent servant fish. He was in a zoologist's paradise. Not a creature that came in there had ever been catalogued before. He wrote reams of notes on the parchment paper used by the citizens in recording their transactions. Particularly he was interested in the vast, lowly mound fish. One time, when I happened to be with him, the receding waters of the chamber disclosed the body of one of the odd herdsmen of these deep-sea flocks. Then the professor's elation knew no bounds. We hurried forward to look at it. "It is a typical fish," puzzled the professor, when we had cut the body out of its usurped armor. "Cold-blooded, adapted to the chill and pressure of the depths. There are the gills, I observed before, yet it looks very human." It surely did. There were the joined arms and the rudimentary hands. Its forehead was domed, and the brain, when dissected, proved much larger than the brain of a true fish. Also its bones were not those of a mammal, but the cartilaginous bones of a fish. It was not quite 6 feet long, just fitted the horny shell. "But its intelligence!" fretted the professor, glorying in his inability to classify this marvelous specimen. "No fish could ever attain such mental development. Evolution working backward from human to reptile and then fish, or a new freak of evolutionary whereby a fish on a shortcut toward becoming human?" He sighed and gave it up, but more reams of notes were written. "Why do you take them?" I asked. "No one but yourself will ever see them." He looked at me with professorial absent-mindedness. "I take them for the fun of it, principally, but perhaps sometime we may figure out a way of getting them up. My God, wouldn't my learned brother scientists be set in an uproar!" He bent his observations and dissections again, cursing now and then at the distortion suffered by the specimens when they were released from the deep sea pressure and swelled and burst in the atmospheric pressure in the cave. Stanley was engrossed in a different way. Since the moment he laid eyes on her, he had belonged to the stately woman who had first nursed him back to consciousness. Maius was her name. From shepherding the three of us around Zyobor and explaining its marvels to us, she had taken to exclusive tutorship of Stanley, and Stanley fairly ate it up. "You, the notorious woman-hater," I taunted him one time, "the wary bachelor, to fall at last, and for a woman of another world, almost of another planet. I'm amazed." "I don't know why you should be amazed," he said stiffly. "You've been telling me ever since I was a kid that women were all useless, all alike." "If I find I was mistaken," he interrupted, "they aren't all alike. There's only one Maius. She is different." "What do you talk about all the time? You're with her constantly." "I'm not with her any more than you're with the Queen," he shot back at me. "What do you find to talk about?" That shut me up. He went to look for Maius, and I wandered to the royal apartments in search of Aga. In the first days of our friendship I had several times surprised in Aga's eyes a curious expression, one that seemed compounded of despair, horror, and resignation. I had seen that same expression in the eyes of the nobles of late, and in the faces of all the people I encountered in the streets, who, I mustn't forget to add here, never failed to treat me with a deference that was as intoxicating as it was inexplicable. It was as though some terrible fate hovered over the populace, some dreadful doom about which nothing could be done. No one put into words any fears that might confirm that impression, but continually I got the idea that everybody there went about in a state of attempting to live normally and happily while life was still left, before some awful, wholesale death descended on them. At last, from Aga, I learned the fateful reason. But first, a confession that was hastened by the knowledge of the fate of the city. I learned from her something that changed all of life for me. We were surrounded by the luxury of her private apartment. We sat on a low divan, side by side. I wanted more than anything I had ever wanted before to put my arms around her, but I dared not. One does not make love easily to a queen, the 311th of a proud line. And then, as maids have done often in all countries, and perhaps on all planets, she took the initiative herself. "We have a curious custom in Zyobor, of which I have not yet told thee," she murmured. "It concerns the kings of Zyobor, the color of their hair." She glanced up at my own carrot top, and then averted her gaze. "For all our history, our kings have had red hair. On the few occasions when the line has been reduced to a lone queen, as in my case, the red-haired men of the kingdom have striven together in public combat to determine which was the most powerful and brave. The winner became the queen's consort." "And in this case?" I asked, my heart beginning to pound madly. "In my case, my lord, there is to be no striving. When I was a child, our only 2 red-haired males died, one by accident, one by sickness. Now there are none others but infants, none of eligible age. But by miracle, thou—" She stopped, then gazed up at me from under long gold-flecked lashes. "I was afraid I was doomed to die, alone." It was after I had replied impetuously to this that she told me of the terror that was about to engulf all life in the beautiful undersea city. "Thou hast wondered, perhaps, why I should be forward enough to tell thee this, instead of waiting for thine own confession first," she faltered. "Know, then, the reason is the shortness of the time we are fated to spend together. We shall belong each to the other only a little while. Then shall we belong to death, and I, when I knew the time was to be so brief—" And I listened with growing horror to her account of the enemy that was advancing towards us with every passing moment. About 20 miles away, in the lowest depression of Penguin Deep, lived a race of monsters which the people of Aga's city called Quabos. The Quabos were grim beings that were more intelligent than Aga's fish servants, even, she thought, more intelligent than humans themselves. They had existed in their dark hole, as far as the Zyobites knew, from the beginning of time. Through the countless centuries they had constructed for themselves a vast series of dens in the rock. There they had hidden away from the deep-sea dangers. They, too, preyed on the mound fish, but as there was plenty of food for all, the Zyobites had never paid much attention to them. But, just before we had appeared, there had come about a subterranean quake that changed the entire complexion of the matters in Penguin Deep. The earthquake wiped out the elaborately burrowed sea tunnels of the Quabos, killing half of them at a blow and driving the rest out into the unfriendly openness of the deep. Now this was fatal to them. They were not used to physical self-defense. During the thousands of years of residence in their sheltered burrows, they had become utterly unable to exist when exposed to the primeval dangers of the sea. It was as though the civilization-softened citizens of New York should suddenly be set down in a howling wilderness with nothing but their bare hands with which to contrive all the necessities of a living. Such was the situation at the time Stanley, the professor, and myself arrived in Zyobor. The Quabos must find an immediate haven or perish. On the ocean bottom they were threatened by the moundfish. In the higher levels they were in danger from almost everything that swam. Few things were so defenseless as themselves after their long inertia. Their answer was Zyobor, there in perfect security, only to be reached by the diving chamber that could be sealed at will by the 20-yard counterbalanced lock. The Quabos would be even more protected than in their former runways. So, they were working day and night to invade Aga's city. But Aga, I interrupted impulsively at this point, if these monsters are fishes, how could they live in air? I stopped as my objection answered itself before she could reply. They would not have to live in air to inhabit Zyobor. They would inundate the city, flood that peaceful, beautiful place with the awful pressure of the lowest depths. That thought, in turn, suggested to me that every building in Zyobor would be swept flat if subjected suddenly to the rush of the sea. The great low cavern, without the support of the myriad of walls, would probably collapse, trapping the invading Quabos and leaving the rest without home once more. But Aga answered this before I could voice it. The Quabos had foreseen that point. They were tunneling slowly but surely toward the city from a point about half a mile from the dividing chamber, and as they advanced, they blocked up the passageway behind them at intervals, drilled down to the great underground sea that lay beneath all this section, and drained a little of the water away. In this manner they lightened, bit by bit, the enormous weight of the ocean depths. When the city was finally reached, not only would it be insured against sudden destruction, but the Quabos themselves would have become accustomed to the difference in pressure. Had they gone immediately from the accustomed press of Penguin Deep into the atmosphere of Zyobor, they would have burst into bits. As it was, they would be able to flood the city slowly without injury to themselves. Now thou knowest our fate, concluded Aga with a shudder. Zyobor will be part of the great waters. We ourselves shall be food for these monsters. She faltered and stopped. But this cannot be, I exclaimed, clenching my fists impatiently. There must be something we can do, some way. There is nothing to be done. Our wisest men have set themselves sheepishly to the task of defense. There it is no defense possible. We can't simply sit here and wait. Your people are wonderful, but this is no time for resignation. Send for my 2 friends, Aga. We will have a council of war, for we 4, and we will see if we can find a way. She shrugged despairfully, started to speak, and then sent in quest of Stanley and the professor. They, as well as myself, had no idea of the menace that crept nearer us with each passing hour. They were dumbfounded, horrified to learn of the peril. We sat a while in silence, realizing our situation to the full. Then the professor spoke. If only we could see what these things look like. It might help in planning to defeat them. That can be done with ease, said Aga. Come. We went with her to the gardens and approached the nearest pool. My fishmen are watching the Quabos constantly. They report to me by telepathy whenever I send my thoughts their way. I will let you see on the pool the things they are now seeing. She stared intently at the sheet of water, and gradually as we watched a picture appeared, a picture that will never fade from my memory in any smallest detail. The Quabos had huddled for protection into a large cave at the foot of the cliff outside Zyobor. There were a great many Quabos, and the cave was relatively confining. Now we saw, through the eyes of the spine-protected outpost of the Queen, these monstrous refugees crowded together like sheep. The watery cavern was a creeping mass of viscous tentacles, enormous staring eyes and globular heads. The cave was paved 3 deep with the horrible things, and they were attached to the wall and to the roof in solid blocks. "My God," whispered Stanley, "there are thousands of them."